So before I start that, I want to kind of reach back to an email that was sent to me after last week's session from Kevin. Kevin, last name, in case you're concerned about that. Kevin is an agrologist. He's also he calls it broadacre crops, and because I'm not from the prairies, wasn't familiar with that term, but he farms broadacre crops, which are grains and pulse crops, so lentils, field peas, faba beans, that kind of stuff, on obviously a huge land base. So the last few sessions, there's been a lot of talk about manure and compost and how great they are for the soil, how great they are for building soil organic matter and soil fertility. However, I just want to acknowledge that for large areas of Western Canada, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and also central and northern BC, really farms have very little access to excess manure or compost. In BC, most of the manure is used on farm. The exception to that is poultry manure, which might be is largely available for use, but poultry farms are centered in my area, the North Okanagan, and in the Fraser Valley. Composts are generated based on waste materials coming out of large cities, mainly Metro Vancouver, and so are very super heavy and expensive to transport, and so they're not being economically hauled to, really further north than somewhere in the Okanagan, maybe Williams Lake, probably not that far north. So farmers in doing that kind of farming are obviously not going to be able to access much in the way of organic materials to benefit the soil. This is a photo taken in East Kootenays of application of biosolids on a hayfield. And this is, some farmers will have access to this kind of a source of organic material and nutrients. And that can be a great addition to the soil fertility, but not always available. I just also wanted to make the comment that my background is really working with farms where nutrient excess is more the norm than nutrient shortage. And I think that's probably the way I've focused heavily on how important it is manures and compost, et cetera, are for soil fertility. And because the farms that have a lot of nutrients are the ones where typically there's a potential for environmental nitrogen losses, environmental issues. So my background has really been working with the commodity groups that have access to lots of nutrients, including nitrogen, and not so much on other types of farms where there isn't anything like an excess of nutrients. Today I'm going to discuss, like I said, nitrogen availability and efficiency, some risks associated with it, and I'm going to focus in on the different types of agriculture that we have in BC. Before we get into that, I just want to review some important terms here, because for those of you who are not familiar, nitrogen, the word N really is the short term for nitrogen, and sometimes I will say N, and I will mean nitrogen. There's also, throughout this discussion, is going to be a lot of talk about soil nitrogen levels, which is really equivalent to soil levels. So nitrate is the plant available form of nitrogen in the soil. So sometimes I'll say nitrate, and sometimes I'll say nitrogen or available nitrogen, and that really is the same thing. Ammonium is a little bit different. There'll be a little bit of discussion of that with relation to manures. The other thing I want to run by and just refamiliarize with you, if you are new to this session, is we'll be talking in terms of kilograms per hectare and pounds per acre of nutrients or of nitrogen. So in agriculture, typically crop nitrogen requirements, the nitrogen in the soil and in manures, other fertilizer sources, it's expressed either as kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year or pounds per acre. So I probably will run back and forth between the two of them. They're very similar in amounts, but basically it's the amount of nitrogen 1 hectare or 1 acre of cropland requires for one growing season. And it it's not intuitive for crops like tree fruits and vineyards, but it was obviously developed based on forage crops and crops where the whole field is planted. So yeah, just so that when you hear these terms flying around, you'll know what it means. Okay, I'm going to start talking about what I call nutrient intensive systems. There are sort of three different types of, I don't know, I'm grouping them, there's probably more, but three different nutrient levels of agriculture in the province. So the nutrient intensive systems are dairy farms, feedlots, poultry farms, and some high value crops that have easy access to nutrients. So this would be something like berries in the Fraser Valley, where there's a lot of poultry farms around, so they are able to access manure at really very little cost. Can also be hobby farms, horse and livestock farms, where lots of nutrients are brought onto the farm in hay and grains. And these types of farms are characterized by abundant nutrients from manure and compost on the farm or locally available. These types of farms are growing to feed to their livestock. This is a field of silage corn, a young field of silage corn that this field will have been fertilized with manure and nutrition fertilizer to ensure optimum yield. This is a high value crop and also a crop that needs a lot of nitrogen. This will be harvested as silage for to be fed to a dairy herd or a feedlot, beef animals in a feedlot. So the second kind of grouping of types of farms I'm going to talk about today are livestock-based minimal input systems, I call them. These are agricultural commodities with really minimal access to nutrients in manure and compost. So this is characterized primarily by the ranching industry, the beef industry. These types of ranches, they have a very large land base, which is used for producing hay or silage or haylage or something for winter feed for the beef herd. These farms are ranches are typically rural, fairly remote. And rather than having excess nutrients that they have to manage carefully, they typically have to conserve nitrogen from the relatively small amount of available manure and use synthetic fertilizer. We'll discuss that in a little bit more depth. So this type of operation is growing forages on large land bases to put up winter feed for the beef herd. Typically, these types of stands typically in BC take advantage of biological nitrogen fixation. So they will have the stand be a mix of alfalfa and grass or straight alfalfa. So it's fixing its own nitrogen. These types of forage stands can use a lot of nitrogen, but as long as there's, like I said last week, more than 50% legume in the stand, they don't need any applied nitrogen. The third type of crop grouping I'm going to talk a little about it, I call crop-based systems where there's no livestock, so they don't have a manure resource to utilize. So grains, crops, tree fruits, berries, vineyards. So typically nutrient inputs are external, so chemical, synthetic fertilizer and manure and or compost if available. But obviously the access to organic amendments is obviously going to depend on the location and the economics. These things are very expensive to truck. Don't take the truck very far. This type of a system, you're basically trying to retain as much nitrogen as possible, and excess nutrients are not the norm. So let's recap how nitrogen is agricultural systems, because I'm going to be using this, discussing each of the ways that nitrogen is lost and management practices to minimize it. So nitrogen is lost from the crop rooting zone to groundwater in the nitrate form by leaching. So this is, again, I was talking about nitrogen available, and nitrate is the form in the soil. Excess rainwater, excess irrigation water can wash nitrate out of the crop root zone. Nitrogen can be lost to the air in the ammonia form in a process called volatilization. It can also be lost to the air as nitrous oxide in a process called denitrification. And it can run off of soils basically into surface water as any of the forms of nitrogen. It can run as manure, as soil, as the nitrate form, as the ammonia form, and find its way to surface water, depending on the conditions on farm or ranch. Okay, we'll start first talking about nitrogen management and efficiency in nutrient-intensive systems. Like I said, these are the systems that typically have excess nutrients and are therefore have as a challenge managing those nutrients to optimize efficiency. So their nitrogen management issues are primarily related to excess nutrients, not insufficient nutrients. So what are the nitrogen sources on intensive farms? So dairy farms, poultry farms, farms, feedlots. So a primary source of nitrogen is purchased feed. These type of operations will purchase a lot of blended rations consisting of grains and a protein concentrate. They will also purchase forages as hay or silage, all to be fed to the livestock. These purchased feeds are typically very high in protein, which you will know from previous chats. Protein is about 16% nitrogen. So if they're high protein feeds, they're also high nitrogen feeds. So lots of nitrogen coming in purchased feeds. And we discussed last week that about 70% of nitrogen in purchased feed ends up in the manure. Poultry farms are an interesting case all on their own, because typically poultry farms have very little land base. So they're not land applying any of their own manure. Manure, as we saw in a table last week, the manure tends to be very high in nitrogen. They're not spreading it on their own land base because they typically have, or a very small amount of it on their own land base. So poultry manure, by and large, throughout BC, is available for use by other farms. So it's typically used on dairy farms, used on berry farms, whoever can basically access it. So on this type of farm, any shortfall from manure would be made up by applying synthetic fertilizer to make sure you meet crop requirements. Yeah, again, just to reiterate, this is super important because people will wonder where does all this nitrogen come from? Well, it basically comes from the feed. So when you bring feed in, you're importing nitrogen from off into your little nitrogen ecosystem. And as I said, 70 to 80% of nitrogen consumed by livestock and poultry is excreted in the manure. And you can see at the bottom there that a significant amount of nitrogen per ton of feed fed, you'll end up with 20 kilograms of nitrogen in manure. Okay, so what are some of the challenges of managing high nutrient systems like dairy farms and poultry farms? So typically they're growing very high nitrogen demand crops. So these are crops like silage corn, grass, high yielding grasses that can utilize 250 to 400 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen. But at the same time, they have very high soil fertility because they're able to do annual or every 2 years manure application to their fields. So high nitrogen manure is being applied to fields, and then that results in very fertile soils that have a lot of soil organic matter and a generous amount of nitrogen within that soil organic matter. And it can release up to 150 kilograms per hectare per year of nitrogen. So that can be in some instances up to half or more of what the crop requires. In addition, if you apply manure, you get some release of nitrogen from the manure application. There's about 20% of the nitrogen is we call crop available. So you have that in the year that you apply it. Plus there's some breakdown of organic matter through the growing season, releasing additional nitrogen. And then in some cases, if farmers are not confident that the manure application is going to yield enough, they may also be using some fertilizer N. Although I think in general, farmers are fairly aware of only applying fertilizer N if it's absolutely necessary. But there is an over-application of nutrients, which can lead to excess nitrogen in the manure and the soil, and some potential losses to the environment. Okay, so here, and if you haven't been looking at these sessions, this will be new to you, but otherwise, this will be familiar. This is a couple of snippets from 2 soil reports showing the amount of nitrogen left over in a soil, in a field, at the end of the growing season. And these are 2 examples of high fertility fields, all residual nitrogen. So this is the amount of nitrogen in the nitrate form left over in the fall after the crop is finished growing. You have nitrogen in the first column. I've circled the numbers down below, and it gives a number in total pounds. So that's the amount that they've measured as being available, and estimated amount. So what they do is they measure the amount of nitrogen at the 0 to 6 step, and then they assume that there's also nitrogen available in the 6 to 12 inch. So that's the difference between these 2 numbers. The little snippet on the left is a field on a dairy farm that I sampled last fall. It was sampled last fall. And you can see that this field had, so this is probably a normal amount of residual nitrogen left over at the end of the growing season. So even on this farm, which is in the interior, so not too much concern, about 70 pounds of acre left over per acre left over at the end of the season. The one on the right, you would have seen last week or the week before. This is kind of a worst case scenario. This is not typical, but this can happen if you're not estimating the amount of nitrogen available. You can end up with quite a bit. So this particular field is a field that I measured last fall on a cornfield that had been chicken manure. Anyway, I'm not sure what happened, but they ended up with a lot of nitrogen. So 100 ppms at the top. And at the bottom, you can see that probably upwards of 400 pounds of nitrogen per acre still in that soil at the end of the growing season. Now, that's a huge loss if you've, even if applied manure, if you put chemical fertilizer and manure on, that's a lot of nitrogen that's potentially can be lost. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But anyway, just an idea of a sort of an average high fertility field on a dairy type farm, and a situation where there was obviously too much of something that went on in the spring. So where does the excess nitrate N come from? So as I've said, sometimes you can get more nitrogen released from soil organic matter and added in manure and fertilizer than is taken up by the crop. And this is obviously what happened in that high nitrogen situation. It is very difficult to accurately estimate the amount of nitrogen from soil organic matter and from a manure application. I'm going to talk about how you deal with that in a few minutes. Remedy for this: only apply nitrogen fertilizer if you know that the soil organic matter plus manure can't provide enough nitrogen for the crop. Things like drought or insufficient irrigation can result in a situation where you have excess, and despite your best efforts, if you have insufficient, crop with less than what you were anticipating, less than what you fertilized for, obviously that's something that you didn't plan for. What happens to excess nitrate in the soil in the fall? So just to recap, nitrate, that plant available form nitrate, which is the main available form of soil, is highly leachable because it is not held tightly by soil particles. And this is in comparison with phosphorus, which is very tightly bound to soil particles and typically does not leach unless under some very extreme circumstances. So what happens is that pool of nitrate, it will leach down in the soil profile with rain or with snow melt water or even excess irrigation, and it will continue moving until it reaches groundwater. So in coastal BC, where there's high winter rainfall, that's going to have a huge impact on the night left in the soil at the end of the growing season. And definitely with as much as 0.5 to 1 meter of rainfall over the winter months, the nitrate will be leached out of the crop root zone. In the interior, in the dry, basically everywhere else except the Fraser Valley and Island and other coastal areas, precipitation is much lower, definitely during the growing season, and overwinter precipitation is a lot lower, so that typically nitrate that is remaining in the fall at the end of the growing season will likely still be there in the following spring. It may move down 6 or 8 inches with snow melt, but it won't move down below where the crop roots can access it the next year. Okay, so on sort of high intensity farms, one of the most important thing when you're figuring out how much nitrogen fertilizer and manure to put on is to try and predict how much nitrogen is going to be released from soil organic matter. And obviously the amount that is going to be released depends on the background fertility of the soil. So how frequently has your field been fertilized and manured over the past few years? How much organic matter is in the soil? Is the field irrigated or dry land? Very low fertility sites. So these would be sites where you'd only be putting a small amount of nitrogen fertilizer on every year, but no manure, no compost. They may release no nitrogen from soil organic matter. In fact, they may bind nitrogen if you do kind of hit it with a manure application. On the other hand, very high fertility sites, which are frequently manured, fertilized, or a recently plowed down perennial forage stand, they can yield a lot of nitrogen. So there is a range, so you need to understand the fertility of the fields that you're dealing with. I went through this quickly 2 weeks ago. I'm going to go through it again, not in great detail, but some lab test reports will give you an estimate of how much nitrogen is going to be released from soil organic matter. This is a soil test report from A&L in Ontario, where a lot of BC soils go for testing. This is this is 2 little snippets from that soil test report. And this lab will give you what they call, on the right-hand side, ENR, estimated nitrogen release. So they will, based on the soil organic matter, and I've got that circled on the left, so you can see that their algorithm predicts how much will be released based on the organic matter content of the soil. And so the amount of ENR declines with soil depth. This sample was taken at 3 depths, 0 to 6 inches, 6 to 12 inches, and 12 to 24 inches. That's the three lines of information. So this soil test report predicts that this field may release up to 150 pounds per acre. It's again difficult to know how accurate it is, but at least it's an estimate. Here in BC, for people who are doing nutrient management planning, we have the Ministry of Ag uses soil fertility factors. So based on the fertility of the soil, they have a number that you use, just a ballpark number to estimate nitrogen release from organic matter. And with the red arrow, I've pointed at the fields that would be highest in fertility. So these are fields that are manured annually or a plowed down forage stand, up to 90 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which is 110 kilograms per hectare. And as you run up the table, you'll see that fields, the top line, they're indicating minus 90 pounds per acre release, which means that if you have a field where you haven't fertilized it for years and years, and you suddenly throw some fertilizer or manure at it, it may actually bind up or immobilize a significant amount of nitrogen, but this is on a relatively short-term basis, and this is related to microbial activity in the soil. But basically, to know that if you're dealing with high fertility fields, you should assume that at least 90 pounds per acre nitrogen is going to come through the growing season from soil organic matter. So one strategy, if you do have residual nitrate in the soil in the fall, or if you're not sure if you have residual nitrate, and this is relevant for high rainfall areas of BC, so Fraser Valley, Vancouver Island, where if you don't do something, you're going to lose all of that nitrate over the winter, and it won't be available for next crop. So if you can plant a cover crop, or I know they're starting to do some experimentation with intercropping with annual crops like silage corn. If you can get a crop growing that will grow well into the fall, it will take up some of that nitrate in. So something like fall rye, which is fast growing, cold hardy, so you can get growth well into the fall, and it will take up nitrate before the winter rains start. So yeah, plant it as early as possible. It will scavenge nitrate from the soil and prevent it from being lost over winter. And then you plow down that cover crop in the spring. And the nitrogen that you managed to scavenge from the previous fall and didn't lose will be available for your crop. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the most important tool for figuring out if your nitrogen application rates were accurate, and if you ended up putting on too much nitrogen or getting more release from organic matter than you. And this is a tool called post-harvest nitrate testing. We talked about this in last year's series. For intensive agriculture like dairy farms and feedlots and people who have lots of manure, this is a super important tool for trying to figure out how you did. How did you do this year, and how can you adjust things for next year? So basically you collect soil samples in the fall, you collect them to the 1 foot level throughout your field, and you take a look at how much residual nitrogen in the nitrate form is available. How much is left over in the soil in the fall? So what does that tell you? So if you take a soil sample in the fall after the crop is finished growing or your last harvest, and the soil nitrate level is low, and this is in the top foot of the soil or 30 centimeters, then something less than 10 or
Hi, Ruth.
15.
You're coming through broken. I think you're going to have to recap the last 30 seconds.
Okay, I'll keep going. If you have high residual nitrogen in the fall, greater than say 25 ppms, the crop didn't use all the nitrogen that was available. So this could mean that you put on too much manure, too much fertilizer, manure plus fertilizer wasn't needed. Release from soil organic matter was higher than expected, or like I mentioned before, your crop yield was lower than expected. So based on the soil test results, you can adjust for next year. You can either increase or decrease nitrogen application. If you had excess, maybe next year you want to just put manure on and don't put on any nitrogen fertilizer. What else does post-harvest nitrate testing tell you? In interior BC, where there's low winter rainfall, any nitrogen in the nitrate form that's present in the soil in the fall should be there in the spring for crop use. So you should consider that when you're figuring out nitrogen requirements for next year. So you should consider that if you've got 100 pounds per acre in the soil in the fall, that will be available for next year. Then just either manure or add fertilizer to make up the difference. In the coastal areas where winter rainfall is high, I think you can assume that that nitrate will be gone by next spring. So that's the amount that you basically lost from the system, and it shouldn't be accounted for in planning for nutrients for the next year. But you should consider it a kind of a report card to tell you what you need to do for next year. A little bit about how you take the samples and a little bit about our new regulatory requirements in BC. So post-harvest nitrate sampling is now a requirement under our new AIM code, Agricultural Environmental Management Code of Practice, which came into law in 2019. All fields greater than 2 hectares, or all farms with more than 2 hectares of arable land are now required to do post-harvest testing once every 3 years. And for nitrogen, the testing should be down to 30 centimeters or 12 inches. If your soil samples come back all low, below there's a trigger level, then you're not required to do any more soil testing until basically 3 years later. If some fields are elevated, then the requirement is to do another post-harvest nitrate test the following fall, and with the hope that the nitrate levels are lower next year. So that's a new requirement. The 2 buckets on the right-hand side, typically soil phosphorus, potassium, and other nutrients are done on a 0 to 6 inch or 0 to 15 centimeter sample. So if you're sampling to meet AIM code requirements, you would probably want to do 2 depths of sampling. So two buckets, that's a soil auger on the ground beside it. You would take drill down 6 inches, put that sample into one bucket, and then go back into the same hole and go down another 6 inches and put that into the other bucket. The average of the 2 will be your nitrate numbers. You submit both samples to the lab, and then you'll get a nitrate number. Nitrate just for the deeper sample, and the surface sample should be analyzed for nitrogen, nitrate, phosphorus, potassium, whatever else you're going to look at. Okay, so that's enough about leaching losses of nitrate. Now let's have a little quick session on volatilization losses of nitrogen. So this is another important potential loss of nitrogen from manure, which can reduce its value. So about 20% of manure is in the ammonium form, which is, when you apply it to the soil, is immediately available for plant use. So 20% of a manure application. However, that fraction is susceptible to be lost into the air as ammonia gas in a process called volatilization, so after application. And you can lose anywhere from 10 to 90% of the ammonium, depending on the conditions when you apply manure. So 20%, it's kind of 20% of the manure in the ammonium form is kind of a freebie. It's kind of like fertilizer N, but you can lose a lot of it. So in order to minimize the losses and make sure you get the maximum benefit from the ammonium in the manure, the losses are influenced by several factors. So the most important ones are whether you surface applied or incorporated it, and how long it takes until you incorporate it. So on bare land, obviously incorporation is key, and incorporating it within a day will ensure that you can capture most of the ammonium. If you surface apply and don't incorporate for up to a week, you might lose, 50, 60, 70, 80% of it. And also the weather during and after application is super important. Hot, dry, windy weather increases ammonia losses versus cool, wet, still conditions. So an early spring application on a damp soil, sort of when you're expecting rain, is probably the best situation if you can't incorporate the manure. So on a hayfield or something. Okay, so another type of way you can lose nitrogen is denitrification. We don't typically talk about this a lot in soil fertility management in BC, I think partly because it's almost impossible to measure how much loss from denitrification. But basically the mechanism is that in warm, saturated soil, so in warm, very wet soils, this would be kind of early in the fall, after rain, but before the soils have cooled down, you can get a significant amount of conversion of nitrate, N in the nitrate form, to N2 gas. So estimates are something like 10 to 15% of nitrogen can be lost when conditions are suitable to promote denitrification, which is not all the time. And so nitrous oxide, which is a greenhouse gas, is an intermediate step in that process. Again, difficult to measure, but basically bottom line is if you've got nitrate left in the soil in the fall, and this is applicable to coastal areas where soils are going to be wet and warm into the fall. Whether you lose it to nitrate leaching or denitrification, it's basically lost, and you won't get any crop benefit from it. So you can minimize, the same way you minimize the loss by trying to minimize the amount of residual N in the nitrate form in the fall, you will also minimize the amount of denitrification that is occurring. So a scavenging crop that can take up nitrate through the fall will also help to minimize denitrification by removing some of that pool of nitrate in soil that can potentially be denitrified later in the fall. Okay, so that's sort of the main three potential loss areas for intensive agriculture. And now I'm going to turn to maybe talking about some extensive livestock-based systems and the type of nitrogen management tools for minimizing loss. So these, like I said, these are beef and similar extensive types of agriculture where they have less access to nutrients in manure and compost, and typically have a very large land base that they use for growing winter feed for the beef herd. And in the summer months, the beef herd is ranged away from the home farm, and the fields are used for hay production. And in this type of system, you're really trying to conserve nitrogen from the available manure, and you're likely to have not enough nitrogen versus too much. So what are the nitrogen sources, crop growth on these types of operations? So synthetic fertilizer is going to be very important, obviously, if you don't have a manure resource to apply or access to compost or other organic amendments. But synthetic nitrogen fertilizer is very expensive. And so typically ranchers tend to use quite a low application rate so that they make sure they have a reasonable crop yield, but not the maximum crop yield that they can get. So it's a trade-off between fertilizer cost and yield. They will make use of biological nitrogen fixation and grow alfalfa as part or all of their forage. There is some purchased feed, but typically they're trying to grow all their own hay to feed their beef herd. They may buy a little bit of hay in if they have a situation where they can't grow enough, but it makes it very expensive. And they are also trying to manage the manure that is deposited on their winter feeding and calving areas. So synthetic fertilizer, biological nitrogen fixation, and also nitrogen cycling within the farm. So forage takes up nitrogen, it's fed to the cows, they're fed on the hay fields, they poop 70% of that nitrogen out, and it gets returned to the soil. So you're just making up the difference between the amount that can be cycled through the crops and manure and the amount that is removed from the system in the growth of the beef calves. Okay, so to compare with an intensive agriculture type of field, the two little snippets of soil test report on the left are from two different fields on two different ranches, and the one on the right is the high nitrogen one that I showed from a silage corn field that had been recently amended with poultry manure. So the one on the left is from a ranch that really doesn't use any nitrogen fertilizer at all. So you can see at the end of the growing season, there's something like 4, maybe 8 pounds per acre of nitrogen, like virtually no nitrogen left in the soil. All of the nitrogen released through the growing season was completely used by the crop. The one in the middle is a ranch that does use some nitrogen fertilizer, not a lot, but they fertilize to meet a reasonable crop yield. And so that field had an estimated amount of 50 pounds of nitrogen per acre. Again, not a lot left over. That's a pretty low level, and that, because it's in the interior, that will be available next year. Contrast that with the farm that had access to lots of manure while I said that's not a typical situation on an intensive farm, that can happen. So usually on beef operations and this type of operation, the amount of residual nitrogen you're worried about is minimal. You're really not worried about losing nitrogen to leaching. You're way more likely to be short of nitrogen than have an excess. One of the things that is important on this type of a system, though, is to monitor irrigation rates. So you can actually, whatever nitrogen in the nitrate form that's available in the soil during the growing season can be leached with over irrigation. So it's super important to monitor your irrigation rates and make sure that you're only irrigating to wet the soil rooting zone, the crop root zone. Understand the differences between a clay versus a sandy soil in terms of how much water it can hold before the water starts to move down below the crop root zone. Soil moisture sensors are an option to monitor soil moisture levels if you're not sure if your irrigation rates are excessive. Another important area to monitor in this type of a system is the winter feeding and calving areas. So this is a picture. This is a picture of a field that is used for winter feeding and calving on a beef ranch in the interior. You can see that there's waste hay left over from feeding. There's manure pats all over the field. So this is an important source of nitrogen. It's important to understand that when you feed or calve in an area, you're adding a bunch of nitrogen to the system. So it'd be important to spread the manure and waste feed around equally so that all the soil gets in the field gets a benefit. Rotate these areas around if you can. But also the other important thing is the risk of runoff from these types of, these areas on a ranch. Because you've got an accumulation of manure from overwinter feeding, if there is runoff from this type of a site into surface water during snow melt in the spring, there is the potential for manure and particularly manure to end up in surface water. So this is to stay away from surface water as much as possible and avoid sloping areas where there is likelihood of runoff into surface water during spring snow melt. I just wanted to show this slide of the difference in nitrogen in the spring on a hayfield versus a calving area. So the snippet on the left is an area that has been used for calving for a number of years. The one on the right is just a regular hayfield that typically doesn't get used for winter feeding or anything. So you can see that there's a significant amount of nitrogen, more nitrogen in the field. So just to be aware that you are adding nitrogen to the field, and that's a field where you may not need to put much fertilizer on it. And it's also an argument for moving areas around if possible, not always possible. Beef operations, this type of operation, obviously use of legumes, perennial forage stands, including legumes. So typically alfalfa is grown all through BC. That's a very important source of nitrogen, utilizing nitrogen fixation. So it will, as long as the stand is more than 50% legume, it will supply all of the nitrogen requirements. So none will be needed to be applied. And when you plow down that field, you'll get a big release of nitrogen. So if there was an interest in planting some other kind of a crop, like a barley crop or cereal crop, after the plow down would be a good time to do it. Also contributes significantly to soil organic matter. Okay, the third type of system I was going to talk about, crop-based systems, grains, tree fruits. Typically access to manure and compost for soil fertility building depends on the location. These types of operations are needing to also to retain nitrogen, utilize nitrogen fixation. So what are the nitrogen sources on this type of farm? Synthetic nitrogen fertilizer, recycling of nitrogen crop residues is super important. So leaving them on the soil as much as possible, using nitrogen fixation, and if available, using organic wastes But obviously, as I've said, that's going to vary with your location and whether you can actually afford to bring it in to add to your soil. Use of nitrogen fertilizer is important in these sort of crop-based systems. Nitrogen fertilizer in the ammonium or nitrate form. Both forms are available for crop uptake within a couple of weeks. So what happens after you applied fertilizer N? There's fairly rapid transformation of the fertilizer into nitrate forms. You can optimize nitrogen management with synthetic fertilizers by applying it at the right rate for the crop, as we've discussed. Time the application as much as possible for when the crop needs it. So, for instance, on a grass field, don't apply all the fertilizer first thing in the spring. Spread it out and apply it after each cut. Incorporate the fertilizer into the soil if possible to avoid runoff and volatilization losses, and use slow release forms if possible. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about those. Okay, so this is applies to any farm, obviously, using fertilizer. It is possible to lose a significant amount of the nitrogen from a fertilizer application to volatilization, the same way you can lose it from a manure application. So I've just given a brief discussion here about what and when kind of thing. So the urea and ammonium fertilizer are most susceptible. Liquid fertilizers, like a liquid application, is less susceptible to volatilization than solid prills and those white nitrogen fertilizer prills. Worst case scenario, you can actually lose up to 50% of the nitrogen, but with management, it can be minimized. Losses are going to be highest in the first couple of weeks after application. The mechanism, so why does this happen? The mechanism as to why nitrogen is lost is basically related to a pH increase in a very localized area right around each prill. As it sits on the ground, right around there, the prill itself causes an increase in the localized pH, and that ends up converting the ammonium, which is the form it comes in, which is not volatile, to ammonia, which is volatile. So it's a pH-related conversion of the ammonium to the ammonia, and then once it's converted to the ammonia form, it can volatilize into the air. Okay, so how do you minimize volatilization losses of nitrogen on bare soil? The most important thing you can do is incorporate it by tillage. So till it in a minimum of 2 inches down, and the idea here is that even though the localized situation will convert it to ammonia, you've trapped it in the soil if you can get it in. So apply it in a timely fashion so that you're going to be disking up the field fairly quickly, or apply it when rainfall is forecast to wash nitrogen into the soil, or apply irrigation. And it takes a minimum of ½ inch of rain to dissolve prills. So on covered soil or perennial crop, or where there's a lot of crop residue on the soil surface, it's more difficult to incorporate. So losses will be higher under warm, wet soil conditions. So if you can apply fertilizer earlier in the season when the soil is cool and when rain is anticipated, or irrigate it early to wash the nitrogen into the soil. On dryland sites where this is not possible, and other circumstances as well, a slow release form of nitrogen could be a better option. So slow release nitrogen fertilizers, these would be excellent for reducing volatilization losses and also for releasing nitrogen throughout the growing season when crops need it. So crops need nitrogen throughout the growing season, small amount at the beginning, and then building up to a peak as crop reaches its peak, and then dropping off. Some crops it needs it throughout the season because you're doing 3 or 4 cuts of hay. So a slow release fertilizer, there's all kinds of them. This is one that is available. It's a mix of a polymer coated and an uncoated fertilizer. So the uncoated part of the fertilizer will become available early in the spring. The polymer coat breaks down slowly throughout the growing season, releasing nitrogen as you go through the season. One thing to remember with this type of fertilizer is that it does take some time for the nitrogen to become available. So make sure you apply it early enough in the season so that it's available when the crop starts to grow, significantly starts to grow. I want to go back to, this is what I talked about last week a little bit, microbial inoculants. On grain farms or other operations where you don't have access to organic materials, so that you can't build soil fertility by adding manure or compost, commercial microbial inoculants may be a good option. So these are mixtures of microbes. They include free-living nitrogen fixers. So even though they're not doing the same job as legume crops that have a rhizobial symbiosis with bacteria, they're free living in the soil and are marketed as increasing soil nitrogen available. So improving the amount of nitrogen that's going to be released from soil organic matter. I said this last week, I'll say it again, just that if you're going to use them, because there's not a lot of research available, if they've worked for you and you have seen a crop increase, that's awesome. But a good strategy, if you think that these might be useful, is to try test strips to see if you see any improvement in growth noted from using them. Okay, I'm just going to wrap up here with a couple of slides. In this type of a system, obviously incorporating legumes either as part of a crop rotation, soybeans and corn, or alfalfa and corn, or as a cover crop, is going to build nitrogen, add nitrogen to the soil, and provide it to the following crop. As I said last week, there are a couple of limitations to biological nitrogen fixation. I just want to focus on the last one, which I mentioned last week, but I'm going to say it again, which is that if you rely on biological nitrogen fixation by growing alfalfa or cover cropping with legumes, you just have to remember that with each crop you remove from a field, you're also removing all the other nutrients besides, in addition to nitrogen. So eventually you will deplete the soil of phosphorus, potassium, micronutrients. And so soil testing is important to keep an eye on the soil levels of other nutrients if you're using biological nitrogen fixation for nitrogen provision. So that's all. I'm finished. Thanks for listening. I don't know if we have any time for a couple of questions or if we just want to wrap it up here. If anybody has any particular questions, there's my email address. You're welcome to shoot me an email. It's been great. Thanks everybody for listening. I hope it's been helpful, and enjoy the rest of your day.
So hi Ruth, if you do have time, there are questions here, but other than that, would you prefer to have people email you? Are you short on time here?
No, I'm fine. I just thought everybody probably has to get back to their busy and important lives, their jobs, whatever. But sure, I've got a few minutes, no problem.
It's that's entirely fair. If you want, we can answer a few here and then head off in a few minutes. But usually we're tight for time because there's a session immediately after this, so we've got a bit of luxury here. So let me just ask you a few, and then we can get everyone to email you later on. Okay. So first one, for the amount of nitrogen release for most crops we are mostly concerned with, what's the available in the top 6 to 8 inches? What's available at 24 inches would likely never reach the crop?
Well, it depends on the crop rooting depth. So it depends what you're growing. Crops like alfalfa, even silage corn, which is an annual crop, the roots can actually go down a couple of feet by the end of the growing season. So it really depends on the crop. Really, you should assume that, yeah, again, depending on the crop, but you should assume that that nitrogen down to maybe even 36 inches is going to be available, especially with a perennial forage crop. Grass roots and alfalfa roots can go way down. So obviously, when a crop is first planted, the roots are not very deep. So the first year you plant something like a perennial forage, it's not going to be rooting very deep. But thereafter, I think that was the gist of the question, I hope.
Yeah, if not, feel free to email her afterwards. The next one, incorporation.
If I missed.
Oh yeah, sorry, cutting you off there. Incorporation of manure or organic nitrogen, example, feather meal. If we're trying to do a low/no-till, how deep do we need to incorporate it? A light rake or a proper till? Context question relates to avoiding denitrification and accessing the most amount of nitrogen through microbial breakdown. Thanks.
I think it's shallow tillage. For honestly, so if you do a surface application, I'm trying to think about feather meal. I'm guessing there isn't much ammonia in it because you're not going to have a volatilization loss. Microbial activity, even if you do a surface application, the microbes are going to work that stuff in between the worms and all the other little soil bugs. They're constantly churning the soil, and so they will work it in. You're going to get a more obviously a way quicker response if you can till it in. And I would say, depending where you are, if you till it into just a couple of inches, you're going to probably get the maximum benefit, the minimum chance of denitrification, maximum benefit from it. If you get it into the soil, the microbes are working on it quicker and breaking it down and making releasing the nitrogen for your crops.
Okay, next question. Would it make sense to do pH and T testing in the spring rather than the fall?
If you're located in, you could either place. If you're to figure out what kind of nitrogen leftover you have in the Fraser Valley and high rainfall areas, then you pretty much have to do it in the spring. But again, okay, what am I trying to say here? Post-harvest nitrate testing in the interior in the fall is a great tool in the fall or the spring in the interior, because there isn't much difference between fall and spring, and that will tell you what left over in the soil for next year. In the Fraser Valley, even a spring soil sample that's going to tell you you've got no nitrogen left over, it's all going to be leached. Really, it's very difficult to predict how much. In that case, you're going to say that there's no leftover nitrogen. It's been lost, and so the only nitrogen from the soil is going to be what's released from organic matter over the growing season. So, in the interior, fall or spring is fine. In coastal areas, a fall one is better because it'll tell you what was left in the soil and give you some information about what you should be putting on for next year. Did you put too much on this year? Should you reduce it for next year? Why might that have been?
Excellent. All right. Well, I think we've answered most of the questions here. If you do have any more burning questions for Ruth, please send her an email. Ruth, thank you so much for your time and expertise today. I just love your presentations, and I know everyone in this room does as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. It's been great. Have a good afternoon.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.